Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better in one of two ways. Number one is you can go to iTunes and write a brief review, or number two is you can go to interviewthefuture.com and simply make a donation. Today, my guest on the show is Maria Farrell. Maria is an Irish writer and keynote speaker on technology and the future. She's one of those hidden gems that I discovered absolutely thanks to Cory Doctorow and her articles on, for example, how to deal with the end of the world, feminism, and our smartphones, or why the internet must be more than Facebook, and especially my all-time favorite of 2020, the Prodigal Techbro, have become some of my favorites that I have read for the past year. So, without further ado, welcome to Singularity FM, Maria.
Thanks a million, Nicola. I am such a huge fan of this podcast. I can't tell you how much of a thrill it is to be on it.
Thank you. The pleasure is entirely mine. I honestly think those articles are like absolute gems, and the Prodigal Tech Bro is like a piece of genius, I swear to you. And we'll get back to that. But before we begin, perhaps we should ask, who is Maria Farrell? If I were to meet you in person somewhere and I never heard of you, never read any of your stuff, and we just introduce each other in a pub, who is Maria Farrell?
Oh man. So because I'm a writer, normally if we met in a pub, I would absolutely be operating in stealth mode. I would probably tell you as little as possible about myself because I would be more interested in hearing about who you were and how you fitted in and what your stories were. So that's the the writer side of things is everything is just kind of material and everything is fascinating. I know all my own stories. They have no interest for me. So, but that's not the conceit of the question is, yeah, who are you? So I am a writer who's come to being a writer via the scenic route. I loved reading and writing, obviously in school, so all writers have always been, I think, readers. And I was very well brought up, not just by my parents, but by my older brother, Henry Farrell, who is a political scientist. And he brought back a lot of science fiction and fantasy to our house when we were teenagers and a lot of postmodern literature. So the way I think of myself is absolutely always through and in and with science fiction. That is just my native literary culture. And so in my early 20s, I figured there's no point writing. I have nothing to write about yet. And so I had various careers, film industry, film production and TV, and then tech policy, which I've been in for 20 years. Living in different places from London to Paris, Brussels, Los Angeles, Washington, DC, then Edinburgh for a stint as an army wife, and now back in London again. So I guess I finally kind of found my material, and I've been writing on the blog Crooked Timber for I think we've been doing it for about 15 years or so. And that's where I've learned to write. And so at times I have kind of come back to the skill of writing, I hope, but with now I know what my life's work is. I know what my material is. And so probably if I wasn't operating in stealth mode, what would I say? I would say, I don't know what I would say. There are so many labels. I could say I'm a middle-aged white lady, who lives in a city. Or I could say I'm an immigrant in an age that despises immigrants and yet relies on them. There are so many ways to peel that orange. So I guess I'll probably just leave it at that.
Yeah, and notice how all of those underplay your own self. My wife always says that a sign of personal development when you meet a new person is always how much questions they ask versus how many answers they're focused on giving. You clearly focused entirely on the questions that you want to ask of the other person. You're clearly more curious about them and want to find more about them than them finding more about you. And that's pretty much the best compliment that my wife can pay to anyone that she's met, because as she always says, it's a sign of personal development. And it's a thing that I often fail, I have to say. Even though I'm supposed to be Socrates, I fail that probably 50% of the time. So I need to work a lot more on that. So great. Now both my wife and you are inspiring me to do better. So let me ask you though, which part of Ireland are you from, just out of curiosity?
Oh yeah. So I was born and spent my first 5 or 6 years in Dublin, in Dunleary, and then actually my dad is now retired, but he was a surgeon, and so we moved to England, the north of England, in Darlington for about 2 years, and then we went back to Ireland. He got a job and in Tipperary in Cashel. So I am a Cashel woman. Although most Munster people would say I'm a bit of a blow-in, but I'm a Tipperary woman as well as a Dublin woman. So I'm a bit of a mix.
You know, let me ask you some question that totally popped out in my head right now for totally kind of crazy. I don't know even where it came from, but it's going to sound very strange and kind of unrelated. But Ireland is a small country, and one person who's been making or getting a lot of public attention in the last, I don't know what, 7, 8, 10 years has been Conor McGregor, uh, UFC fighter. What do you make of him as a representative of Ireland? Out of curiosity, because you're such a cultural critic, technology is a big part of our culture, and you nail sort of the core of the cultural tendencies and issues and problems and things we must be aware of and beware of. What do you make it? Because that's kind of like many people now. Oh, Ireland, UFC fighting champion country, Conor McGregor, who is kind of super scandalous type of guy. What do you make of all that?
Yeah. Funnily enough, I haven't actually thought about him all that much, and I probably should have.
Because he's
I mean,
right now one of the most successful Irish kind of self-made people. He takes the media everywhere he goes by storm in any kind of field. He's an investor. He has a whiskey. He's so many things. He's the best in the world. If you listen to him, he's the best thing for Ireland that ever happened in the history of Ireland, and for the world probably too.
um, he's not a person I've given a huge amount of thought to beyond kind of noting him and going, wow, clearly a force of nature, a self-made media sensation. Got some kind of somewhat antisocial tendencies that I don't particularly love. Um, but oddly enough, I guess he exists in a sort of a cultural bubble that I just don't particularly have access to. So I think probably a lot of aspects of the Conor McGregor phenomenon have more or less passed me by.
Yeah, and I don't even remember if he's also a Dublin boy. But we'll be speaking about narratives a little later on and how they connect to technology. And maybe that's why he popped into my head totally randomly, but maybe not so randomly, because you have that whole narrative of the fighting Irish. And he's like, he's put the claim on living the mythology, on sort of embodying the mythology, on sort of taking the mythology into reality, right?
Yeah, of course. And when I was thinking about him, you're so right. That's exactly the kind of the pre-made, pre-cooked story that he drops into is, the fighting Irish. They don't obey rules. They'll have fight in the streets. They'll drink and do whatever. And whereas when I was thinking about him, I was thinking more like a Loki kind of a slightly, an unrules bound kind of, that kind of Viking uh, sort of uncontrollable kind of godlike rascal. But yeah, he does of course fit into the fighting Irish thing, which surprise I'm not a huge fan of, but it is what it is.
Yeah, no, and the strange thing is that I think you may even have a slightly more positive opinion of him than I do.
I'm trying to be diplomatic because I live here.
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, and of course he's an Irish boy after all. So yeah, I can sympathize with that. Um, okay, so let's go back on topic here then. Where should we begin? What, in your view, are the biggest issues that humanity is contending with today, that our civilization is or must resolve if we are to survive and hopefully thrive in the 21st century? So perhaps we should start with the big picture and then we should zoom down to whatever narrow topics we figure out.
Sure, yeah. I think the biggest sort of meta issue that we're facing is we have to look our own failure in the face, and we're just not ready to do it. And I think the biggest issue we're facing, to do with climate change, the corrosion and in some places collapse of democracy, and rampant economic and social inequality all over the world, to the point where some people have called it a global civil war, is that things are getting worse. And at least those of us who've grown up in a post-enlightenment kind of political culture have always sort of felt that we were part of a narrative of things were getting better. We're going to have the Enlightenment, and we're going to have the Reformation, and we'll have science, and science will tell us things, and those things will be true, and on the basis of which we will build better societies that generationally improve. And of course, that kind of the idea of human progression as and almost or if you're on the left, the kind of historical materialist version of that says the structures of society will cohere in certain ways as to create a revolution, like all of those kind of the engine of history constantly motoring forward, that has come to a stop in a very profound way that I think all of us around the world are reckoning with, because all of the narratives of improvement and progress, they just are swept away in the face of climate change and so many other things that we're facing. And so before we even get to the point of dealing with those issues, and those mega wicked problems that they're part of them, I think we have a sort of an imaginative challenge. I'm going to try and put it in a positive sense, in that we have to start imagining our way into a future that is going to be materially worse than the present is for many of us, by no means all of us, and trying to imagine ways to live lives and to think of futures that are materially less comfort and less abundant for many of us, but that are nonetheless good. And we're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into that in so many different ways. I think a lot of the Trump moment is the fact that a lot of people in America almost unconsciously are aware that we are at the probably just the beginning of a declinist narrative. Things are getting worse for a lot of people, and I think a lot of the anger and denial, is one way to deal with that. Like, you can sort of take a psychoanalytic approach and go, we generationally have a massive. Are we allowed to F-bomb on this podcast?
We're allowed to say whatever we want to
Whatever
say.
we want. Right. Well, so like,
Don't edit or cut out your character, your personality. Actually, your persona and your language are part of who you are, and your narratives and the way we speak, just like their narrative of who I am, whether we like it or not. Because, one of my earliest fear of starting a podcast was first, my accent, most of all. I was like, okay, people are going to listen to me and say, well, this guy doesn't even speak proper English. Forget about, listening to him, right? So we all have these stories that tell us why we're not good enough and why we're sort of insufficient. And that was my story that I had to overcome. And I still struggle with it sometimes. But, so anyway, instead of hiding it, I decided to confront it and share it. And so we can say anything we want and be who we are. That's the whole point.
Cool. Thank you very much. Sorry, it's I've got permission. I've got the class pass, because I think Anglo-Saxon words can be quite useful. They're all words to me. I'm a writer. They're all
You're Irish and I'm available. Bulgarian originally, so
right. Yeah, come on. These are So basically, I would say that the big kind of meta issue we're facing is there are a couple of ways collectively and globally we can deal with the fact that life is going to go seriously downhill in some very important ways. And one is anger and denial, and and othering and blaming other people and doing the Trump voter thing, which it's not, it would not be my chosen way, but inside the kernel of all of that denialist anger is a belief and a noticing that things are very fucked up. And
that acknowledgement was actually key to understanding. My wife's family, half of her family, that's to say on her mom's side, is from Rochester, New York, and all of them voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And the reason was precisely of that narrative, because he was the only one who had a story that acknowledged that things have gotten worse for them. And, if you're from Rochester, New York, that used to be called Kodak City. And after Kodak went bankrupt, now that city is literally like Detroit. It's like a dead city. It's destroyed. If you go downtown, it's like locked up stuff, boarded windows. It's horrible. Um, the property value went down because people don't make so much money anymore. It's just really, really bad. It's a town or a city with former glories like Detroit in decline. And so Hillary didn't have that narrative at all to capture those votes, and it's also another reason why they voted for Donald again in the
Yeah,
last election. None of them that I knew changed their vote or their mind on him even, right?
yeah, he's
And
so
part of it
dominant.
is
Yeah.
the power of that narrative that you're talking about so well, and acknowledging the fact that we have a problem. But what do you make, and I think you're kind of expressing my own sentiment there, what do you make of Roger Penrose and the Better Angels of Our Nature, very voluminous book that claims that we're better than we've ever been? Or the next step up from there, I think, which is kind of the most tech utopian story ever come of Silicon Valley, is like abundance. The future is better than you think. Right? So not only the present is the best we've ever had, but the future is better than you think.
Well, it is for those guys. It's great. Come on. They live at the pinnacle of a civilization that is wildly unequal and that is far more interested in, putting sensors in toothbrushes than clean water for people to drink. So yeah, of course it's great for them. When I think about the Trump voters and the profound and nihilistic racism that is their fundamental view of the world, it's because they see it as a zero-sum game, and it's going to be a epic Manichaean battle, and it's a fight for survival. And they decided that they're only interested in white people and white men, and that's the kind of the Trump thing. And I see exactly the same in some Silicon Valley people I have interacted with. I did a job a few years ago about it was just a comms job for I'm kind of trying to figure out my way around my NDA here. Basically, a particular way to replace some of the technical infrastructure that was going to need replacing because governments were going to go away. And it was a job that was fascinating, particularly because the people I was talking to were very, very clear about their view of the world, which was that within 20 years, democracy was going to go away, states were going to go away. And so they needed to put in place enough stuff so that the internet would continue to work. And on one sense, that's good point, practical, good guys. You've got a bit of money behind you. Go and build your infrastructure. Do I have to mention it involved blockchain? Probably I don't.
That's guaranteed.
Yeah. And but on the other hand, it was just a slightly more upmarket reaction to the Trump voters, which was shit's going to get bad, and we had better look after our own, because we are already drawing up our positions for the final battle, and that's how it's going to be. And so everybody is kind of preparing and setting up the toy soldiers for the final act of the apocalypse, instead of like, fuck me, we've still got 20 years, maybe we could use them to try and prevent it. So like that's that really, you've got the poor white guy and you've got the privileged white guy, and each of them is this incredibly nihilistic death drive that just says, bring it on, I want it, I want this, this horrible fight to the death, and we're all going to die. And it's this really Nietzschean kind of point of view. And I'm like, I don't think you live in a world where you've really had consequences, physical violence and danger and consequences all of your, to me, like it's such a, that kind of death drive, whether it manifests, in the Silicon Valley with some really, really cool, nice press releases and venture capital behind it, or whether it's, guys, with their rifles up in their truck behind them. I mean, it's kind of the same thing, which is shit's going to get bad, and that's a really good opportunity for me to pull up the drawbridge and hopefully shoot some people. Like, that
I
is just
think there's something else too, though. I think at least on my wife's family, what I've seen there is also a light in the tunnel. So it's not just this nihilism, but Trump was the only person who made a promise that things would get better for them, right? Hillary, for example,
yeah,
Hillary never had a narrative which first acknowledges their struggles and second, gives them hope for the future, right? Where Trump acknowledged their struggle and said, let's make America great again. Now, that may be a total lie and totally unrealistic and totally like problematic at so many levels in terms of the delivery of that promise, but at least in terms of acknowledging their pain and promising to solve it, that kind of delivers for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's our challenge for the next century, if we are to have a next century and a century after that, is to figure out narratives, which are narratives to me are just are things we think inside of, things we use to think with, that use unite both emotion and cognition. And we need to have ones that allow us to think about how we do deal with the fact that a lot of things are going to get worse, and a lot of people individually and collectively, we're going to lose things that we care about, and we're going to go on losing them. And the world is going to look very, very different. We absolutely have to figure out ways to deal with that, in our politics and in the institutions that we use to address some of those problems. But just to have it on record, and I know this isn't where you're going either, but I just have zero tolerance of the white people are poor, therefore we should expect them to behave less well than, let's say, black people in America, where they've got some problems, they've got real structural stuff that they're dealing with day in day out, and they're not even allowed to to frown or curse or anything about it, let alone carry semi-automatic weapons into state capitals. Like there's such a double standard of behavior and expectation of who we get to feel sorry for and who we're institutionally meant to sympathize with, and whose problems are real problems. Like I don't see we'll probably get there eventually, but so much of this stuff, like if I was going to say, like, my to borrow that horrible concept, but my red pill is feminism. When you look around and see the amount of male violence in society and the way we live, from being able to go out for a run, to dealing with the criminal justice system, to all sorts of, to being told you're not in pain when you're in pain, to it's just endemic and it's everywhere. Like, that's a problem society needs to be fixing.
Look at what's going in Poland now. They have the largest protests since Solidarność, since the fight against communism, since the collapse of communism. And it's mostly women who are protesting, of course, because they're the ones who are legislated by a bunch of old white Catholic guys what they can and they can't do with their own bodies.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like, when I think about so much of this horrible hard right politics and this kind of strongman politics that is just everywhere. It's from Modi, it's in Venezuela, it's in Brazil, it's in the US, it's in the UK, it's in Poland, it's in Hungary. I mean, it's a disease. It's bigger than COVID. And the one thing that unites all of these, they manifest differently in terms of local culture, ideology, policy choices, paths to victory. But the one thing that unites them all is misogyny. It is the gateway drug, and like, once you see that, you can't unsee it.
Well, let's grab that line then here for a little bit and go a little down the road. So one of my greatest failures on this podcast is the fact that, as someone pointed out to me, 93% of my interviewees have been white dudes, and 7% have been white women. And just maybe a few months ago, I had, let's say 6 months ago, I had the first woman of color. And I've been actually, in the last, let's say 9 to 12 months, I've been actually doing predominantly women on my podcast. So let's say out of 3 interviews, 2 have been women and 1 have been a man. And it's going to take another 10 years before I probably sort of even the scales, so to speak. And of course, my wife has been on my case for years now. But how would you explain that? Here I am, supposedly well-educated, well-intentioned, kind of postmodernist aware, feminist aware, politically aware person. And yet in my own podcast, in my own work for the whole last decade, I've been reinforcing the status quo, at least in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so. So I did have a quick look at, the kinds of people you have on, and obviously they're all people who are interested in futurism. And futurism, as we currently construe it, is a an obsession, if you like, of a certain kind of well-educated, particularly educated white guy in Western countries, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, for some reason, call it patriarchy. We seem to think that the people who have the most to say and think about the future are white guys. And so there's a certain cultural positioning. So the people who come to prominence, the people who get speaking gigs, who get asked to write about the state of the nation rather than about women's issues or race issues or LGBTQ issues. Like, white guys get to write about everybody, and they get to be general, and we have to be assumed to be particular. So there's a bit of that, but I think you're the kind of guy that pushes against that stuff a little bit. So I think then there's something else, which is, I mean, a good bit, but then there's something else, which is let me think. Just the whole project of futurism it's a very, to me, when I think about the kinds of books that are involved and the kinds of ideas that are at play, it seems to be quite thin, and it seems to be sort of people who already have a lot imagining how they could have even more. So when I think about the issues, they are stuff like, how do we conquer death? Like, fucking clean up water first, what will our transhuman existence be like? Fucking walk out the door and try and be a woman walking in an urban area and not be, have your body and everything like catcalled and be afraid, be like, design your life around trying not to be raped. If you want to talk about transcending the body, try and live in a female body or in a trans body, for a while. So like, these are just they're such fucking uptown issues. I just can't even, sometimes.
I
And I'm
think
being a
Plato,
little unkind, but there's something there.
yeah, I think Plato once said that uh, philosophy is not for the hungry. And I think translating that to what you just said, it makes me think, and it kind of explains it. It's mostly, futurism is mostly for people who have a good present, right?
Right.
They've kind of, and that's an idea I got directly from what you just said. Like, people who are pretty comfortable, pretty secure, pretty happy with where they are today, right now, in this present. Of course, there's always exception, but by large, right? And those tend to be white dudes, very well educated, working with some nice tech job, making six figures or more, and then they have the luxury of contemplating the future and thinking, okay, how can we go to the next level? Well,
Yeah.
immortality would be one nice thing to have, right? How about
Yeah.
space travel? How about, genetic manipulation? How about all those other cool gadgets? Mind uploading, you name it, right? So now that kind of makes sense to me a lot more than before. But let's apply that thought even more so, because you did a very nice application of feminism with respect to our smartphones. So tell us what feminism can enlighten us about our smartphones and our relationship with them.
Sure. Yeah. Well, slightly. I'll probably just slightly praise the piece that I wrote about this, and so it was yeah, a year ago. I was in Austria giving a talk about giving a talk, and it was about smartphones, and I just pulled my I'm gonna, where is it? Here it is. So here's my smartphone. It's it's a
It's a
little
Nokia?
Nokia.
Are you kidding me? That may not even pass for a smartphone.
It does not. It does not quite. It does text. It does voice. It purports to do other things, but it's appallingly bad at them. You don't use it for anything else. And it was me and Eugene Kaspersky actually were giving this talk, and so I said, like, hands up, show us hands up everyone who's a smartphone, and of course everyone puts a hand up except me, and it turns out Kaspersky, who also has.
Oh, that's hilarious. But doesn't that say a lot, though? Kaspersky especially, too.
Right. Yeah, but But unlike me, who has to put up with all manner of inconvenience for not having a smartphone these days, from travel booking to getting lost and finding yourself, Kaspersky has an assistant who I think is also called Maria, who has a smartphone, and so she goes around with her smartphone, serving his needs the whole, his logistical needs the whole time. So he kind of gets to
He's cheating.
externalize, yeah, the whole being trackedness of a smartphone. Anyway, roundabout story. So what was it? Yeah, so I just said, everyone, could you please put up your hands if you have a smartphone? Yes. And I think the next thing was, can you put up your hands if you trust your smartphone? And basically, every hand, like loads of hands went down straight away, and a couple of them kind of lingered a little bit in the air, and then kind of went, no, I don't really, and they pulled it down. And in the end, it was just one guy, embarrassed looking dude in the back going, sure, of course I trust my, what? What are you trying to say? And, and so that kind of got me thinking about, oh my God, this is like, I mean, feminism tells us what this is, in that a relationship where you love somebody and you depend on them, but you don't fundamentally trust them. That is kind of the definition of an abusive relationship, where that person or that object is telling you that they're looking after you, they're acting in your best interests, whilst all the time they're not, and they're doing stuff behind your back that is making you unsafe in different ways. And gaslighting you, telling you things are fine. It's just all in your imagination. You can trust me. I'm Google. I'm in your phone. It's fine. Or I'm your phone, phone provider. I'm only using your data for good purposes because we have a contract. Did you read your contract? No. So basically, when I kind of looked at phones, I realized that a feminist critique or feminist analysis of our relationship with our phones show that it's a device that is kind of really intimate to us, and that is like in our kind of almost the intimacy of our person. We carry it, next to our flesh almost. It's everywhere, and at the same time, we don't trust it. I mean, that's wild when you think about it. You're moving through the world with a companion the whole time, and that companion is doing stuff that you don't trust and that you kind of know is not in your interest. So
Basically,
I
they're
guess the thing
cheating
that
on you all the time, and
they're
and
yeah,
they're lying to you uh, because they love somebody else more than you. That's to say, they're sort of big tech uh,
yeah,
white bro masters, and they're lying to you in the sense that not only they're cheating to you, but they keep trying to reassure you that you're number one for them, that they love you more than anyone or anything else, and yet behind your back they're doing exactly the opposite.
yeah. And also, I think it kind of gets at something in that our relationships are complicated and they're multivalent. Are we still kind of love our phones because they serve, not just they serve a purpose, but they kind of are how we interact with and with the world and with other people. And so, we both depend on them and love them and don't trust them. And that's kind of how, abusive and problematic relationships function, in that they're never all terrible, and the guy will tell you he's gonna this time he's gonna change and he's gonna improve himself. This time Mark Zuckerberg has been on a listening tour and now he's gonna really, change how the company works. And so I think feminism, I think like several other isms, but it's the one I know best. It exposes power relations that otherwise we work very, very hard to obscure. So it does something that we do in when you're writing fiction. One of the theories about fiction is that it's doing what we call defamiliarizing. It's making what is obvious and logical and rational and just like furniture. It's making the familiar seem strange, and so that's kind of what feminism does. Is it shows us where the power is flowing from and to, and shows us that things are more complicated and knottier
And
than
that's
we
where
might
we
have.
get all the insights. That's where the brilliant insights exactly come out. And your article did that extremely well. I'll link to it. And it brings me very nicely to my next step here in our conversation, which is the importance of power and knowledge. And I'm not even sure if I took these from this particular article or from some other one, because I read like so many of yours in the last 2 or 3 days. But in one place you say that if knowledge is indeed power, then the question we should ask is, in which direction is it flowing? And the answer is obviously away from us. And that's true with respect to our phones, but it's also true with respect to our all of our other tech stuff, like social media, for example, right? And then people, particularly who are concerned with, let's say, privacy, what you were saying is that when thinking about privacy, we shouldn't think so much about secrets, but again, we should think more about power, right? Who has it, who is challenged, who is reinforced, who gets more power from this kind of relationship or this kind of a setup of technological or other kind. And that's where feminism in your analysis gives us brilliant insights that I believe are very much worth paying attention to you, which is why I've become a fan of your blog and I'm going to keep reading it now. I find it very insightful. Um, do you want to add anything to that?
Um, I, Let me think. Well, yeah, I think I guess just to say briefly that a lot of the maybe the first 10 or even 15 years of my career in tech policy, we used to talk about privacy and data privacy a lot, certainly in the context of European data protection law. And over time, it became apparent to me that that wasn't enough. And I think the new regulations coming out of Brussels are trying to also to kind of wrestle with the fact that it's not enough to have privacy. You need autonomy. It's not just about there's a private sphere and there's a public sphere, and we have to manage our relationship as we go back and forth between those two things throughout the day and over the course of our lives, but more that data flowing away from us takes power away from us in ways that we don't even know for a long time. So a surveilled city where you, like the one I live in at the moment, London, is a city where when you go to a protest, your face will be captured and it will be added to a database. And a lot of people will say, well, you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to fear, but they have not really understood or thought very deeply about how information is used against people in different contexts later on in their lives. So I guess it's just to say that, yeah, privacy isn't enough. It's not just about putting data in particular boxes and keeping it there, but it's about really, really fluidly and thinking of how information changes through time and how it forecloses possibilities for us.
Yeah, and a great another example of yours of your articles that comes to my mind, and a great example of how that works, is the one about how China is exporting autocracy around the world, and it's exactly dead on this topic about privacy and surveillance and so on, and how countries in the third world, like Uganda, for example, in Africa, are literally buying sort of like ready to go Chinese surveillance autocracy, sort of autocracy in a box, if I may. Can you
Yeah,
tell us a
yeah.
little more about how that works and why is it being so successful in the third world?
Yeah, sure. So straight off, I'm going to say I've got one point of sadness about that article, and here is the thing that like I this is really self-serving, but I kind of think sometimes when you're writing a piece, and mostly you don't write the headline, but you can suggest a couple of them. I try to like suggest a headline that just has the whole piece in a box, like in like 6 lines. And this one came to me, and it was just like boom. This one is called Autocracy as a Service. Like, guys, that's what the piece should be called. And my normal editor was actually moving away from I think had perhaps left Medium already at that time. And so I got this like really kind of painful and protracted headline. So sorry about that, but it's just like sometimes, the piece will just sell itself. Autocracy as a Service. Like,
I
that's
agree
just,
completely
it
with you.
already.
Yeah, it's a
So
much
anyway,
better
so I'm a bit
title.
much better, right?
Much better.
I'm not going to be the first writer to complain about what the headline ended up being, but I do think they missed a beat there. Anyway, so yeah, the deal is, so I was in a small Gulf state around this time last year, doing a consulting job for a nonprofit, and just happened to be having dinner with the head of the communications regulator in that country, and I had been thinking about this whole China thing for quite some time. The fact that we know that through by helping to set regulations at the UN level, that sort of make it easier to do procurement, that buys China's products, and all the way kind of up and down the stack, from selling the equipment to writing the model laws to training the sensors um, to even providing Belt and Road Initiative loans for countries to buy China's kit at the national infrastructure level. Like, China is just answering a call that is going out and that is being ignored. And so I said to this asked this guy, so are you what's your take on China? Like, have they made an offering to you? Are they are they being helpful to you? Um, because I was there to kind of do the human rightsy thing, of let's do cybersecurity, but do it in a way that doesn't just concentrate power into the state and help us do surveillance and censorship. And this guy was, open to that message, but he said, look, the Chinese listen to us. Like, they not only listen to us, but they know that we have, certain needs. Like, my minister is on to me saying, we've got to do this 5G thing. I don't know what 5G is, but it sounds really important, and we've got to do it so that we're kind of, because countries are really into league tables. Governments are, really watch what other governments are doing, especially in the Arab League, and or any regional intergovernmental organization. And he said, I don't want to buy this kit, but it's serving a need and it answers questions that we have, and the West isn't doing that for us. You go back 10 years to, say, the Hillary Clinton State Department, which for its various and many sins was still presenting a view of technology and the internet that said, here's the internet. It is going to solve some of your problems. It's going to help you do democracy, because that was their big push at the time. But also, it's going to help you, drive up living standards in your country. It's going to help you figure out what to do with all of those semi-educated 23-year-old men that you have who will otherwise go and be radicalized. Like, it's going to give them jobs where they get to put on a shirt in the morning and earn a reasonable wage. The internet, like, so they had kind of a story about the internet, what it was going to do, and also a pitch and kind of the companies behind them that said it's going to help you out. Then the Arab Spring came, and the other side of that pitch became apparent to various authoritarian countries, and it was no longer as attractive.
Another example of exactly that kind of dynamic that you're talking about here, how third world countries are a lot more receptive and sort of idealistic about the way they can take and utilize technology for their betterment, is the case of Facebook as an internet provider. Tell us a little bit about that piece that you wrote there about why the internet should be a lot more than Facebook. Because as we know, Facebook has a program in a number of other countries, with some notable exceptions. By the way, India did a research on that and very notably decided to abstain. So India basically had the guts to turn down Facebook, which good for them, good on them for that. But most other places didn't. And some of the most notable examples that you give in your piece are things like places like the Philippines and Myanmar, perhaps.
Yeah. So, and I know you've talked about the Myanmar, thing as well, and the genocide there, and the role of social media, particularly Facebook, in helping foment that. So the deal is that Facebook.org is one of, a couple of different companies' offerings to mostly lower, least developed countries and middle income countries. So, anything all the way from, let's say, a Lesotho, a tiny little landlocked country with very little infrastructure, and to a Brazil, which is a very large, to some extent wealthy middle income country. And all of those countries have a problem, and that problem is, how do we roll out internet infrastructure throughout our entire country? Lesotho is incredibly mountainous, and Brazil is incredibly large, so it's a it's a big challenge. And they I won't even go into the whole telecoms kind of history, but for various reasons, Facebook in particular has come along to those countries and said, we're going to do a deal with your biggest mobile phone provider, because a lot of countries have kind of leapfrogged into mobile phone internet provision, and we'll do a thing called Facebook Zero, where we will basically subsidize the mobile phone provider so that when customers go onto facebook.com, all of that traffic will be free to the customer. And so what it means, on the one hand, if you're a minister of communications and Facebook is coming along with their lobbyist, and Google and all of several of those companies have somewhat similar offers, but and they say, look, we're going to give you basically free internet rolled out to your entire population of people. Um, you're not going to say no to that. The telco is not going to say no because they get a nice fat subsidy. Facebook is delighted because now it means they get a whole new world of users. And I guess the only people who lose, so who are the losers? Because so much of what we do elides who's actually losing out here. Where's the dog that didn't bark? And it means that people will turn on their mobile phone, perhaps slightly more sophisticated than this particular Nokia, not quite smartphone that I have. And they go straight to Facebook, and all of their messaging to everybody else, that they write to is through Facebook. All of their news comes from Facebook. In countries that have used this, you find that very, very quickly you go from, very quickly achieve huge figures like 70, even 90% of people getting their news through Facebook. And so for the first couple of years, probably all goes well. And then very soon you find out that you're a Philippines, and the Philippines has a remarkably high, almost saturation level of Facebook use because of this free offer. And anyway, you find out very quickly that everybody getting their news through Facebook is actually not such a good thing because you've externalized the cost of that. And what is the cost? The cost is of course all the political division, the propaganda, this, before you know it, basically the hollowing out of your ability as a state to function, because people no longer believe in science. They no longer believe in any kind of mainstream media. Suddenly what looked like a fantastic free offer becomes almost like it's almost like a fairy tale poison.
It's like a toxic pill.
Yeah, it's a toxic pill. So where were we going with this?
And then Duerte moves into that vacuum that's created after the devastation, and then you have Facebook basically powering a genocide, like in Myanmar, for example, right, against the Rohingya minority. But what do you say to people from Facebook who say, well, we didn't do that, we didn't know about it, we're just a provider, we're just a platform, what people use us for and do with us is up to them, that's not our responsibility? How do you address that issue?
On a specific instance, I think the New Yorker and others have done some very good reporting that Facebook did not have enough people on the ground who actually spoke the languages in Myanmar, and had been told and had been alerted and should have acted sooner and did not. And that's on them. That is absolutely on them. To the broader point, I would say that they are running a platform. It's technology. Technology has certain affordances. And it is a fact that lies and hatred make more money than the truth does on those platforms. They amplify certain kind of messages and certain kind of sub narratives that are not even proper narratives. And so absolutely it is on them. But I think the broader point that I remember trying to make in that article about, Facebook is not the internet was a bit broader than Facebook, but it was that, so the internet was developed, it's an open source set of technologies based on protocols and standards that allow us to put different building blocks together. And basically it's kind of more like a horizontal network. And the whole point of it is, all you have to do to be part of the internet is basically use HTTP. Like that's it. You can get yourself an IP number or an IPv6 number. We won't go into that, but you basically, all you have to do to be part of the internet is to use some completely publicly available technical protocols. And that's why the internet grew. Every country was able to do it. And it's kind of gone from that, which is, we call it kind of the topology of the internet, the kind of the physical layout, which is kind of, slightly bumpy, but more or less kind of a layer that went around the world. And now it's been kind of gathered together into these skyscrapers, these silos of kind of hierarchical organization that say Google is pulling it into itself, every single layer of the internet that previously was available for other companies to do and other companies to provide and interact with it different levels and in different ways and build different things. Increasingly, Google provides everything from DNS resolution to to hosting, to content distribution networks. It has its own ones, literally to sub-oceanic cables. So in some sense, you don't have to be a competition economist or a purist to kind of realize that if the stuff that used to be kind of distributed throughout the technical ecosystem is now concentrated in a very hierarchical way under business units, and for particular, for very specific profit motives of very geographically confined tax-based organizations, that is a very different network topology to what the internet was designed to do. And you don't have to be a technological purist to worry about this, because you just realize, hang on a second, like if I'm a small company in India and I'm wanting to be, to do basically, if I'm a bright young guy or woman in India and I want to do technology stuff and make money, am I going to build out new stuff on the internet using open standards and protocols? Or am I going to design an app that is going to go into the Apple App Store and that is going to make 0.001 cents per download for 100,000 downloads every week? Of course, I'm going to pick the latter. So because we kind of siloed everything into these really vertically integrated stacks, it means that anyone who wants to do internet stuff has to be part of them. And it means that they have to use proprietary protocols. They have to obey the rules, often content rules, of the companies that own them. And the entire possibilities of what we can do with the internet for the next generation are going away. So, some people that I work with call this climate change for the internet, because it's like a lot of the choices that we have made in this generation to consolidate and vertically integrate are completely closing the door on the possibility to make genuinely disruptive new stuff with the technological building blocks of the internet. So that's kind of broadly what that piece was about, was just that, if the internet to you is just facebook.com, like if that's all it is, and it's like building an app to sell in the Apple App Store, like you are only seeing it's like, I don't know, it's like, getting an
Replacing the
enormous.
gatekeepers of old with the gatekeepers of new, in a way,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So we had, like, let's say, 3 or 4 major networks in, let's say, the United States back in the day, the good old days, and 3 or 4 major daily newspapers and magazines and stuff. And you had to go through those gatekeepers sort of to get a message out. Then sort of we had the cyberpunks who sort of idealized the internet as this free sort of beyond the control of the space of the state space, where anything was possible for them and for anyone else to go. And now we're kind of converging, and there were new sort of ideas and people and corporations that grew into that space, which kind of destroyed or took all the power away from the old gatekeepers. But now the irony is that they're becoming the new gatekeepers, and it's kind of an oligopolistic situation where, let's say, 4 or 5 of them, big tech, are basically 80-90% of all traffic on the internet today. So basically, we're not into that sort of like decentralized free competition and like all ideas are equal situation that the cyberpunks dreamed of. But now we're again in that situation where you have to fight the men to be able to get a message out, or you have to play by their rules on their platforms that they own, and they can kick you out anytime they decide, for whatever reason you're inconvenient or inappropriate for them.
That's right. And, Tim Wu is very good on how, communications industries consolidate over time. We've seen it in several others over the last generation. This stuff happens. It happens unless you fight against it, and unless you do competition law in such a way as to not just go, oh, does this make internet more expensive for people, or does it make it less expensive for people? Like, if that's the only question that a competition regulator is asking, of course it's going to look fine to them. So we've kind of been around the block with this a few times.
And the sad irony is that one of the creators of the PCPI, what is it, PCPI ITP protocol, Vint Cerf, one of the so-called fathers of the internet, now works for Google. So I tried to get him on my podcast, and we were going to discuss a variety of issues, one of which was this. And he was very positive about the whole idea, and then we had to kind of go through a third person to approve through my sort of like questions and topics of discussion and things like that. Basically, we had to kind of get an approval by Google PR or something. And I told him straight up, I never send out my questions before the actual podcast for anyone. I love what Windsurf did for us and for the internet, and it like the underlying protocol is free and in the public domain because of him and people like him. But I don't do exceptions for anyone. And the reason is I want to be authentic and I want to be honest and I want to get the original first authentic reaction of people when I give them the question. And also I want to be genuine. I want to be honest. And that was a problem. And
Yeah.
the interview never happened.
Oh,
Right.
that's a shame. Yeah.
So, and that was very disappointing for me because on the one hand, he did this pioneering work, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. And on the other hand, now he's I don't want to call him a sellout, but now he's a Google man. And
Yeah.
and
So I've
they
done
can
it. Yeah.
decide where and when he could or he should engage. And that to
Yeah.
me is regress. It's not progress. Both for him in a personal sense, he's a less free man as far as I can tell. And of course, who am I to say Windsurf is less free man? He probably gets paid, $250,000 at least, if not $500,000 a year. Google takes him around everywhere. So in some ways, he's a freer man probably than before. But in my world, he's a less free man if he has to get approval by someone else, and they can effectively bar him from coming to my show or do things that he might find interesting, though challenging.
Yeah. I was editing with him in Bologna 2 years ago, and um we we were dealing with the whole arguments about disinformation and the platforms and the fact that the technology the affordances really push hard right content much more easily. And he was very much taking the view that this was kind of an invitation only event, but he was there as the Google person, that, and well, platforms are platforms and people can use them in the way they use them, and it's not really our fault that bad things happen. And it's, I've kind of met him at various times over the years because he was the chair of ICANN when I first went to work for it. And I have huge respect for him, for what he's achieved. But I think, at Google, he's a Google person. I think they let him do space stuff and that he's really interested in that. And it's very cool, space internet, not going to lie, it's
Sure.
fun stuff. But, you're the open internet is not what's happening at Google.
Yeah.
It's Google is assuming the internet standards and protocol, making
Space stuff is a diversion of the real issues, and
yeah
unfortunately, and I'll disappoint probably 90% of my audience by saying this, but I'm sure they have noticed this. I started as a Singularity fanboy 15 years ago, and probably slowly over time, but especially in the last, let's say, 5-6 years, the Singularity has become almost of a side issue on my show. It's an important issue how we deal with AI, but it's not the primary issue that we're contending today with as a civilization, in my opinion. We're not there yet anyway. I don't think we're coming to that point within the next decade at all. We have much bigger and much more urgent pressing problems we have to resolve before we deal with it. So in a way, just like the space internet is a diversion of the real internet, and so they're allowing him freedom to talk on that or deal with that and not to deal with the real issues. Likewise, I've shifted my attention a lot less away from the Singularity and more on the bigger technological issues and ethics and how that comes into play.
yeah it's it's funny, our visions of the future, as I guess they've gotten perhaps darker, they've also got a bit more realistic. But I think it's a good thing because the way we think about the future, I think at the moment is much more. I think a lot of early futurist thinking was really only thought about the past and thought about history in very, very functional ways. And history almost as like a Marxian, a history machine that was going to drive, had brought us from. It was kind of like almost a deracinated, like a thing that wasn't really part of humans, but it was like a machine, and we could like learn how the machine worked, and the machine was going to go in this way, and some of us were going to be driving the machine, and that was going to be really cool. And I think, as more people have come to the fore, different groups, in terms of having an alternative vision of the present, let alone the future. Um, I think the future is becoming kind of knottier and grittier and less kind of super shiny and fanboy, but also really much more interesting. It's broader and it's deeper, it's gnarlier.
Yeah, and that's the good news and the bad news. So the future is not what it used to be. It's not as shiny and as utopian, and it surely is not abundance, and it surely is not, better than we think. But it could be, or at least parts of it could be. But it all depends on whether we actually have the guts to face the problems we're having to face today, and whether we master, sort of the unity and the long-term sort of pain, if you will, to get long-term gain, to be able to get to any such future, right? And it's not going to be just so easy and sort of happen on its own, as if it was a point on Ray Kurzweilian, extrapolation. It's not going to be like that. It's going to take a lot more blood, sweat, and tears, and effort, and probably people dying before we get there, if we ever get in any shape or form, maybe in some realm or another.
Yeah. And I think the way we think about we is changing, and both horizontally and vertically, in terms of like the way we think about now who matter and who count. That's a much more it's a different and more diverse group of people. It's still not all the way there, but it definitely is a much different. And the we who we think about in the future, that's also changing, because I think I like the one thing I spent a lot of time thinking about a couple of years ago when I wrote those pieces about how to cope with the end of the world, was really about kind of decentering the we, the us. Like, who is the we think gets to see the end of this story? Because, newsflash, I'm 48. You're a few years younger than me, but we are not going to be around to see the next century. And it's we are not the protagonists of this story, and we don't have to see this story end. We just have to like pass the ball forward so that enough options are open for other people. Like, I really think how we think about the future has to change, in terms of like novels. And I'm a novel writer and reader, but like the idea of it being about one protagonist and being driven by conflict, and and there being a conclusion that like ties up all the neat ends, like that is not how we can think about the future. Like, we have to decenter ourselves and understand the future of this planet is not also being decided in London or in Toronto or in San Francisco. It's being decided in Karachi and Mumbai and these cities as well. It's just like we need to just get over ourselves in terms of how we think about, if we don't do well, the world can't do well. That's nonsense.
Yeah, and that kind of captures kind of my whole motivation for what I do for the last decade or so. And to continue that point about Karachi and other places, I had a conversation. One of the reasons why I'm a lot more concerned about the future than I ever was that I went for a lunch with a guy who spent probably 30 years, if not 40 years, sort of living in different places in sub-Saharan Africa. He's an academic originally from Algeria, who is a professor here at the university in Toronto, but basically spent most of his life in sub-Saharan Africa and the Arab world. And he says that it's worse than ever. And the way and the future looks worse than ever for him. And the reason why he says that is the way that he defines it is that he sees now more and more 20 or 25-year-olds than ever before in his life who are without direction and who are pissed off, who don't see a prospect for their life, except for if they get on a boat and get to Europe or something like that, and who really have a narrative that that is not a good or a positive narrative with a light in the tunnel. And that, in his view, is going to create that combustion that can potentially destroy the future, not only for them, which they kind of are struggling with having a future, but even for us who are having a good future, relatively speaking, or are used to having a good future up until our recent past. Because they would be the majority in 20 or 30 years. You know, the biggest growth around 2050 would come from sub-Saharan Africa. There will be 1.2 billion people living in sub-Saharan Africa around 2050, and most of them would be very young people. So obviously they can't all come to Europe. So if they don't have a prospect or a story that gives them a reason to stay there and helps them believe that they can have a good life there and gives them a reason for living and sort of doing something, then the chances are they'll be radicalized. And that was his major concern. And he's been there, again, as I said, for 30 or 40 years. And he says it used to be much better just like, 10 or 20 years ago, when younger people actually believed they can be better off there while staying in their own countries. Now that's kind of impossible. And if you watch the news, even places like relatively successful places like Ethiopia, for example, are now in a situation of civil war, for example, right? Not to mention, Syria and Yemen are worse than ever. And of course, those are the countries with the youngest population. The Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South sort of Western Asia. China is getting old just as much as we're getting old. Japan is already old, right? So the future literally belongs to those people, and they're kind of pissed off and upset, and they surely don't get the narrative of the future is better than you think. They surely don't get the narrative, the better angels of our nature. And that we've had it better than ever. We have it better than we ever had, right? They don't get that. And that's kind of that dangerous disconnect between what Silicon Valley is pushing towards us. And that's why I think people in Silicon Valley were so shocked and surprised when Trump came to power, in a way, because they totally believed their own Kool-Aid. And they were shocked to discover that even people in the United States don't believe that. On a mass scale, people don't believe that.
Yeah, the the Kool-Aid is really something else, because when I travel around, obviously not this year so much, but various Middle Eastern or African countries doing tech policy stuff. A lot of the people I meet are incredibly enthusiastic and positive because they really see technology, be it like doing a distributed learning course in Microsoft programming languages or whatever, or just being able to write apps as incredibly positive and liberatory for them. But a lot of the kind of the middle-aged people, I think, that I come across, and it's a selection bias. I'm meeting people who are in the technology incubator, or working for the minister, or or who are the local lobbyists.
The elite, basically, who can afford to travel and get out of country and all that stuff.
Absolutely. So they've got a different view on it. But I was looking at my bookshelf trying to see if I can't set my eyes on it. There's a book called The Age of Anger, which was written kind of about 2 or 3 years ago by I think a UK author, UK and or Pakistan. And it's basically about that kind of global civil war, the idea of angry young men everywhere, and how many of them there are, and how they will not be happy. And I get it, and I think it's a really important demographic to worry about. But I cannot help but also, wonder why we never think about the angry young women or hurt young women. We're so worried. If you're a historian of like 19th century Europe, you're worried about nationalism and the Young Turks, and it was bad to teach young men to read because now they all want jobs, and now they can't get jobs, and so now they're in nationalist separatist movements against the Austro-Hungarian Empire or whoever it is, or the Ottoman Empire. Like the angry young men are a political force that we worry about and cater to so much more than the hurt young women. And they're invisible to us. They're invisible. And it just always, and I get the point that you're making, and I worry about that too. But always in these conversations, I just feel like, where are the women? Why don't we care what's
Well,
happened?
I'm not excusing that, but one way to rationalize the focus on young
It's
men
because
is
men
that
do violence, men do damage,
exactly,
right?
exactly. We tend to live out our anger and frustration a lot more violently on a mass scale than women tend to do.
And then
So in
individuals.
that sense,
Yeah.
it's legitimate
And
to some degree.
and how is pandering to that working out for us as a species?
That's a good point. Yeah,
Not
that's a
well.
good point.
So yeah,
That
I don't know where the conversation goes from that particular point, because I don't have big answers to it. But I'm always thinking about, who are we not looking at here when we're all convinced that the problem is over here. And they're like, but there are all those people over there who aren't saying anything. What's
But
happening here?
there's a lot of value of asking those questions, and that's precisely what's the kind of the goal of my podcast. And that's why I say it's a symposium, a Socratic style of symposium where people come to have a conversation in a very informal atmosphere. Because a symposium in ancient Greece was basically a drinking party. People went to have drinks, to eat, to have fun, to listen to music while discussing important topics like war, peace, friendship, love, poetry, piety, religion, ethics, aesthetics, beauty, friendship, death, law, religion, you name it. And the idea was that maybe you leave drunk at the end of the party, but hopefully with a new insight at the end of the day, or at least a new question to ask. And that, I believe, creates little cracks and chinks in the armor of the Silicon Valley narrative, because that kind of idea is becoming almost like a religion in certain circles, that the future is better than we think, that it's just going to be great, just let it run its course.
Mm.
And the stress is on sort of almost like passive pious and religious passivity of letting the godness of technology unfold itself to its new coming. And even yesterday, I was arguing with someone on Facebook about, they wrote something like, technology is God or something like that in this whole article. And a few years ago, I had a piece called Technology is Not Enough. And basically the point was, technology would not save us from human stupidity. And so I reposted it there.
But it sure will do a great job in amplifying it. So
Exactly. That goes to my other metaphor, which I've come to use, and that's the idea that, and I believe I kind of created that, but anyway, it's the idea of the magnifying mirror. You see, technology is a mirror because it doesn't have an essence of its own, but it merely takes on the essence that we give it.
oh
But
my
it's
God,
not.
you know what? Sorry, I'm having a slightly out of body experience, because that is exactly what Vince Cerf said on that panel in Bologna 2 years ago. Now I remember it. Um, yeah, he said technology is just a mirror. It just reflects back to us who we are. And I remember making the argument, which you're not doing here, which is a different thing. Me saying, well, actually, no, technology has affordances, and these affordances that you have are destroying democracy. And the fact that there's only one of you or three of you, and you all have the same business model, and it's advertising, that is bringing down democracy. And he got really testy about it.
No, I like that because it may help me even improve on that. But I've been using this metaphor now for 9 or 10 years. And the funny thing is that some of the things that I've written somehow end up, I hear in all kinds of weird places. Just let me give you an example. For example, I interviewed one of the founders of Skype, Jan Tallinn, who is this big guy on AI. I don't know if you've ever crossed paths with him. Anyway, and he's an engineering guy, and just like all great engineers, his thing was like something like, well, science is the engine Michio Kaku said science is the engine of prosperity, but Jan Tallinn was saying something like, the most important thing is for us to create a good engine, to create a good rocket. And that's where science is needed, right? Or physics or something like that. And my response to that was like, no, actually, the most important thing is which way are you going to point the rocket towards, right?
Yeah.
And that's not a scientific decision. That's an ethical decision, because you can point that rocket towards Mars or the moon, or you can point it towards your neighbor. And in both cases, you can have the best possible science. And in one case, you can end up destroying the world. In the other case, you may end up discovering a new one. And the only difference is not the science. The only difference is the ethics. So while science may be the engine of that rocket, right? The more important thing is the ethics, because ethics gives you the direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
That's a
the
good
funny
point.
part, the
Yeah.
funny part is that then he went to a conference somewhere, and then he used the whole spiel from me, and I was like, "Holy cow, that's pretty good!" Like, I don't care, I didn't get a credit or anything. That's fine, but I'm happy if it has an impact. So now I'm curious about when, and I want to see the chronology of windsurf, because I've been using that for a decade now.
Oh,
So I'm curious how windsurf came up with this. But my point is actually even more so. The important part is that my point is even more so alongside of what you're saying rather than what he's arguing.
yeah.
Because my point is that right now the narrative is all about let's polish the mirror, let's make the best mirror. And my
Yeah.
argument is, well, the mirror may be important, but the more important is us, because we are the ones who emit and create the image that's being reflected. So instead of focusing on polishing the mirror, why don't we focus on polishing ourselves, improving ourselves, deciding what is the image we want to project in the first place? Who do we want to be reflected and magnified by technology? And if
Mm.
we miss that, then it's only going to be garbage in, garbage out. Because if we are a monster that destroys the world, magnified by technology, that's a suicidal situation, which we're kind of living in right now in many ways, right? With species extinction and collapse and soil erosion and climate change and a bunch of other things, nuclear weapons, you know the list. So, but you still had some very useful tweaks. So walk me through that, because I'm very curious here. Walk me to the part where you don't disagree with, because that's where I can learn the most.
Um, so, well, actually, I'm not quite. Yeah, sorry, I'm slightly lost the track here because I
Well,
think
you
I
had
would like to
an
go back
argument
and
with
forth.
Vint
Yeah.
about him saying that technology is a mirror, and you saying no, actually, it does have certain predispositions and stuff like that, which can damage and do damage democracy, for example.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. It was kind of an unsatisfying conversation, really, because, after I and another woman on the panel pointed out that technology has certain affordances that are because of the chosen, and historically contingent business model of advertising that we're currently using to power the internet, that the amplification of certain messages was a direct consequence of Google and Facebook and those companies. And unfortunately, Vince, to be honest, just didn't want to hear it and got quite testy and kind of breezed past it all, which is fine. That's his choice. Um, but there's a very particular narrative of the present and of the future that is being told by those tech companies, and I think they are in crisis at the moment because it is so abundantly clear that they are not improving the world or making the world a better place, or doing all of those, living out all of those slogans, those incredibly banal slogans, frankly, that are their sort of foundation myths. That they are actually helping to make the world an objectively worse place. And some of the worst things that they've done have been in countries that were not their own countries. And eventually, over time, those chickens are coming home to roost. So I think they are in crisis because they're realizing that their future, the future, their kind of totalizing view of the world, where more and more of the world is assumed into the Borg that is Google. Our health systems in this country, in the UK, they're trying to basically, colonize the health system, and they're being given every help to do so by, the government, which is both inept and corrupt. So, and yet they are not winning hearts and minds. They're not winning the war of narratives. They know that they're living in a world where they're no longer the good guys. And I've gone to things in Brussels in the past couple of years where the Google lobbyists are basically treated and acting a bit like tobacco lobbyists. Like they're sort of the bad guys in the room a lot of the time. And they've been used to being the good guys.
That's
They've been
very
used
good
to
to
being
hear.
the
That
kind
makes
of
me so happy, I can't tell you.
well, a little social discomfort is a small price to pay for the abundant rewards of those jobs.
Because, it's like a little revenge for me. I was there in 2011 visiting Google and Cisco, and I was the asshole always asking some stupid questions that made people not want to have me back. So, for example, I was asking about the Wi-Fi gate. So we imagine this. So we're in Google visiting at sort of like very high-end VP level, and it's like, it's kind of like, oh, we're so amazing and this and that, and then some bald idiot like me gets up and says something like, what about Wi-Fi gate? And the answer to that is like, oh, that was just a couple of engineers who didn't know what they're doing, and just without asking anybody put like a little snooper on a single car. And I was like, hold on a second, that happened in Korea, in a bunch of places, happened in the United States, happened in Europe, happened in a bunch of other places. So I'm counting at least like 40 cars. How is that a couple of engineers? That sounds to me more like a process that's like policy oriented process that's like delineated from up top, right? And then what happens the next time is like, oh, we're going to go to Google. Well, they're not too excited to have you back.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same happened with Cisco. We go to Cisco, and I have the stupidity to get up and ask about the Great Firewall of China, and how leaked Cisco documents were basically discussing about as a great business opportunity where Cisco can help China build because those were leaked sort of, let's say, 2008 2009, and that was referring to about 4 or 5 years before that, when the Chinese were literally setting up the foundation for the Great Firewall of China, and Cisco was looking for new markets and way to expand, and they didn't feel any conscious contradictions or any other issues of like making the pitch to China about how they can help them with that in any way that the Chinese would require.
Yeah.
So it didn't make me very popular and welcome guest.
No, it does not. And it's strange, like just on the kind of slightly anthropological level, the big tech lobbyists are incredibly thin-skinned and touchy and very easily hurt. And I think it's because they genuinely seem to believe in what they're doing, which I guess is touching and sweet on some levels. But when I compare them to really badass lobbyists I have dealt with in my time, intellectual property rights and copyright, American copyright lobbyists. I mean, those are some fucking bad boys. Like, and they play dirty, and they try and get you fired, and they're all sorts of like awful, awful. And at
You
the
had
end
to
of the
deal
day,
with those in ICANN?
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The Icon was one of their favorite playpens. But at the end of the day, you go to the bar and one of them will kind of, raise an eyebrow and go, come on. And I'm like, okay, fine. Yeah, mine's a beer. And you can have a beer with them. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense that it sort of says it's all just a game. But at the human level, they're kind of able to laugh at themselves and see themselves in a way that, the tech lobbyists are. They feel more like ideologues or religious extremists, or that they have genuinely inculcated a particular view of the world, that any threat to that they have an absolutely violent antibody reaction to and can't deal with. So it's funny, it's been kind of strange watching them evolve into people who are kind of lionized and at the center of the conversation everywhere, to still very much at the center of the conversation, but they're now sort of having to play a defensive game, and they're on the back foot. And they are having a harder time trying to sell their vision of the future, which is a vision in which more and more of our lives and the roles of the state and public goods are kind of sucked into these enormous vertical blocks and stacks that they inhabit. They're having a hard time selling that as a good thing that we should all want. They're still selling it, and they are still absolutely succeeding. I don't want to give anyone hope. but they're somewhat less popular, and that seems to really hurt them.
But that's giving me so much hope, because the first step to change is changing the narrative. And if the narrative is starting to change, then we hope we can have real hope that there will be other changes following the narrative change, right? And both of us have thought about the importance of stories and the importance of narrative for some time. Both of us are working on sort of book projects on this. Both of us are aware that there's this kind of vacuum that happened after the terribly idiotic, let's say, if we're nice to him, misguided end of history hypothesis that Francis Fukuyama had in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because for him, you see, we've reached the pinnacle of evolution, so we're not only the best that we have been, we are the best that our society could ever possibly be. So it's the end of history, right? And that idea has been proven to be patently false for the last 20 years. And the problem is now that capitalism as an idea is kind of collapsing, and it's like literally cracking everywhere. And we are not having a narrative that can unite us towards that we-ness that you're talking about, that we. And there's no single narrative, unfortunately, so far that I can see that can be that new foundation that can sort of tell us who we are, where we're coming from, but also give us a guidance towards where we're going in this 21st century.
Yeah, well, I will say in Fukuyama's defense that I think he has sort of, in a strange way, been vindicated by history. In that, well, his take was not that we've reached some pinnacle of achievement and that we're all just going to coast here and more of the world is going to get rich and be Western liberal democracies, but more like there's sort of a his idea that there's a neoliberal consensus that almost transcends politics, and that is infected both the left and the right, has actually been borne out. In that most of our countries that are still democracies are sort of fairly there's kind of a lack of what's the word? There's a certain inevitability narrative about where we are, and that there are only a narrow stream of sensible policies that we can have. I mean, I think he's actually been quite, accurate.
But the problem with that is the idea that, what we need is not so much the state and the different, derivatives, but we need the capitalist neoliberal system. And as long as that underlining system works, everything else will be fine, because that's the pinnacle of evolution for him. And the offshoot of that are other types of misguided theories, which are derivative of his, which is, let's say, the so-called McDonald's theory of peace, right? Which is entirely derived from Fukuyama's, right? So the idea is, as long as capitalism is operating, there will be peace, there will be prosperity, there will be progress. So all you need to do is make sure the system keeps working. But the system is not working, and there's stop progress, there's civil wars, there's no peace, there's massive migrations, there's ecological collapse, there's negative externalities.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think the thing he was right about is that we do get to keep neoliberalism and we do get to keep capitalism. Unfortunately, democracy is going to be a casualty of both of those things, and that has sort of turned out correct, unfortunately. But actually, what I think we need to do first is my kind of project really is thinking a little more to begin with, just at some of the foundation myths we have about order and about power, and looking at them and seeing that actually they're kind of foreclosing a lot of imaginative possibilities for us, and trying to explain the world in a way that makes sense, but actually sort of cuts off ideas from us. So let's see. So first of all, can we talk a bit about stories per se? Because
please,
I've been thinking about this. Okay, so well, there's if you're kind of a novel writing 101. You will be told.
Just if I can interject, because stories are very relevant, because right now, even if the name of my podcast is Singularity FM, there is a predominant story or myth about what AI is or should be. There is a predominant story and narrative about Silicon Valley is and should be. There's a predominant story about what our future is or should be. And now we're finding that those stories are kind of being contested. Right? That's why I was saying I'm seeing a light in the tunnel if the Google lobbyists are not so much the good guys anymore, right? And they're playing
Absolutely.
defensive a lot more than ever. That means their story is not the dominant story anymore, right? And this is where we need to go one step under and look at the structure and the types of stories. So that's perfect. So go ahead now.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, so so if you think about, if you're learning how to write a story, you will probably go to a creative writing class, and at some point somebody will tell you about E.M. Forster, the English novelist from the early 20th century, and how he wrote, "The king died, the queen died." That's not a story, but the king died, the queen died of grief. That's a story. And why is it a story? Because it's got causality. And what is causality? It means one thing caused another thing. And now, once you've got A causes B, whoa, now you've got a plot. So, like, that's what a story is. It's basically saying one thing caused another thing to happen. And when you think a bit more about that, you realize that, okay, so stories are not just, it's not just that these things are connected by a cause, but it's actually sort of making a normative claim about how the world works. You read the story and you take it into you, and the story of, of course the queen died of grief. Queens always die of grief. This particular story, it's basically, you're imbibing the facts of the two deaths, the causal link between them, but also a whole world of like a whole context of, this is how stuff works. Like, this is how people are.
Just
So
a funny little side note. I bought my wife a mug that says, "What is a queen without a king? Only more powerful." Because if you look at it, many times when the king died and the queen didn't die out of grief, she became Catherine the Great, or the one of those great queen, the Queen of England, or something like that. Those female matriarchs.
yeah.
So
Oh yeah, and stories tell, like, even, gosh, we could spend all day just talking about those two sentences: "The king died, the queen died of grief." But there's also an assumption in there that it's the king and the queen who the story's about. Like,
right,
these are the people we
exactly.
should care about.
Yeah.
Like, oh really? So yeah, so those are, so stories like have in them a lot of stuff that is kind of really implicit, but is even more powerful for that. I gave a talk in the European Parliament a couple of years ago, and it was, part of it was about that stories are. I always put the headline in the wrong place in this one, but basically, when you think about stories, there's something that, like, goes into your brain, and you have an order of events. You have a certain amount of structure of feeling that kind of is involved with that story. And if it's a good story, if it's kind of a really slightly meaty, knotty story that leaves kind of unconscious elements unresolved. And I'm thinking the Pied Piper of Hamelin is such a story. It's just kind of a weird European medieval story that something horrifying happens in, and it ends up really unresolved. And you end up, and when you're a child, you hear about this story, which is about a man stealing children from a village that has double crossed him. That story stays in you, and it kind of works on you for a long time. And it causes kind of almost like software subroutines to go off unwittingly in your brain. And if you think about it in a way, a story is like a piece of malware, in that it is software that it's like a set of executable files that go into your brain and make your brain do things and make you have feelings that are attached to those things that your brain is doing. Almost none of this, iceberg theory, almost none of this you have a conscious control over. Stories have gone into you, and they're working on you, and they're working through you in a way, like all you are is sort of a channel that transmits the story to the next place the story wants to go. So, like, yeah, so I just think, when you think about foundation myths, I've been thinking quite a bit recently about the Exodus story in the Old Testament of the Bible, and also in the Torah, because it's sort of the foundation story of the Jewish people who were in Egypt and were, effectively made slaves in Egypt, and were in a really untenable situation. It was dangerous. The king of Egypt was worried about having them there, was kind of entrenching their freedoms. Eventually, two things happened. One, I guess the Exodus story is about the moment where the Jewish people cemented their special relationship with God, and God said, "Put lamb's blood on the door of all Jewish houses," and they did so. They marked all the doors of all of their houses, and that night, the hand of God passed over the city, and all of the firstborn sons of every other house were murdered. by God. And the next day, the Jewish people left Egypt and they began their exodus and they eventually found the promised land. And that
Makes you
is,
wanna be a friend to that God, don't you?
yeah, right. That is a some sense of vengeful God, and it's demanding God. If a God does that for you, oh my goodness, you've got to, that's a serious relationship. You've got to worry about what he's expecting from you. But like that story of Exodus, I mean, that's now, what is it, about 2,500 years old, that story. And if you are a people where that is your foundation story, it tells you you're special because you have this special relationship with God, and that's wonderful. But it also is a story that has wisdom that unpacks itself in you and through you over generations. And it's a story that tells you that one night you may go to bed and the next morning you are going to have to get up and leave your house and flee for your lives. And you may not even be able to bring the ingredients to make bread with you. Like one morning you are just going to have to leave. And for the Jewish people throughout history, you have to look at it and imagine that story. It's not a myth. It's basically a documentary that is repeated again and again, and that story contains vital knowledge, like survival knowledge, that, Jewish people have needed to leave without a suitcase, leave under the cover of night, just to survive. So like when you think, so like, I just think it's such a powerful foundation story, but also that just unpacks and works through you and tells you stuff that you may not know you need to know until you know it. And when that moment comes, you'll have that story in you and you'll know what to do. I mean, that's powerful.
It is very powerful, but that's also true for many other peoples, right? The American story or mythology is that it's a city on a hill, with manifest destiny, mind you, right? So they have certainly a special relationship with God because they're the city on the hill, and they have manifest destiny, which is a divine destiny, right? And Silicon Valley, interestingly enough, sees themselves very much in this kind of religious vein, if you will, right? They're the chosen people, especially the entrepreneurs. They're the chosen people who can literally take us, the rest of humanity, by the hand and walk us into this future that's better than we think.
Yeah.
Right?
And if you were to pick a bunch of people who are less qualified and less capable and more morally culpable, and like the last people who should be leading anybody by the hand, I think you would have to look long and hard for a better group of people. But yeah, these origin stories are powerful. I've been thinking also a lot recently about some like slightly particularly British ones, I guess, because as an Irish person in the UK, it's a complicated relationship, and and there's a lot of love in it, but also a lot of pain. And um, so looking at it from the outside, some of the ways, particularly the English state construes order and the necessity for order, it really binds it up with coercion and pain and suffering. And so a couple of the stories that they really, really, really draw on would be, Hobbes's Leviathan, the idea of, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's the power of, the war of all against all. And Hobbes, was somebody who grew up during the English Civil War. I mean, he was born on it, and the day the Spanish Armada came to town. I mean, he lived a very historically contingent life, as we all do. And he wrote a book about how the state needs to be powerful and centralized and coercive. And if we don't have that, my God, it's all going to go to shit, And that is a very particular piece of political philosophy from a very, really certain set of contexts and circumstances. And yet it is sort of like an origin story for how state power should be, and how state power just fundamentally is. It's a story of people had to get together to pool their sovereignty in some kind of state of nature, and they had to do this because if they didn't put all of their coercive power together, they would tear each other apart. And that is what is going to happen to us unless we have a really strong state that can punish people. And it's a very it's so much of it is it's like it's implicit. It's kind of that executable files in people's minds all the time of, well, of course the state, yesterday, the British state announced that it was once again not going to hold an inquiry into the murder, the state-sanctioned murder of a solicitor, a Catholic solicitor in Northern Ireland 20 years ago, Pat Finucane. And for most people, this is just a non-issue. Of course, the state has to punish people who consort with people they don't like. Like naturally, the state is a coercive, ugly, punitive institution, and so much of that is just down to, no, you've got a really fucked up origin story, my people. Like that is not normal, and that is not universal. You just think it is.
But that's precisely the crux of it, yeah, because the origin story tells us who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going. And therefore, it tells us what we should and we shouldn't do, what is and what is not allowed. Even whom we should marry and what kind of clothes we should wear and where we should go and where we shouldn't go and what we should think and who's God. And all of it is spelled out in that story. And it lasts for thousands and thousands of years. And that's why if we're able to start chipping at that story, one chip at a time, eventually it could crumble. Now, we also need to provide a new story, because in the sort of the vacuous state of story is a very dangerous state also, if there's no overarching story, and if you have like, the sort of that, like, the violence can happen from a diversity of incompatible stories that don't play by the same rules.
Yeah. And at the moment, a lot of the culture wars in this country, in the UK, and I think also in the US, the whole stuff about pulling down statues of slavers and that, a lot of the culture wars are about people trying to come to terms with the fact that the nice kind of pablum that they learned about their history, that the world was joyous and celebrating the arrival of the British Empire, that this is not the case. That it's untrue. It's simply untrue. And it's hard for people to get their minds and their hearts around that, because it requires them to face up to, unpleasant truths. But until you kind of have that foundation of understanding how you got to where you are and how your origin myth was not true. But guess what? Once you've like brushed away the false origin myth, it allows you to, have a more truthful and better one. The American political anthropologist James C. Scott famously wrote "Seeing Like a State." It's a wonderful one. I'll send you the link. But he had a new book out a couple of years ago, and it is called "Against the Grain." And he has pulled on lots of archaeological and different. He's a bit like a magpie. He's pulled on lots of different types of research to look at the origin of human civilization and the city, and in our sort of foundational myth of how people stopped being agrarian and came to live in cities. In our kind of historical imagining, it's something that happened quite quickly. People just realized that there was, this kind of thing where you kind of did a bit of agriculture here, planted some crops, went away for a few months, came back again, and that they realized that was really, really inefficient, and that they wanted to have cities. They grouped into villages. Those villages became cities, and time passed, and soon humans had accumulated enough capital to allow them to do architecture and writing and culture and civilization, right? James C. Scott kind of goes through a lot of stuff, especially in Mesopotamia. And as a child, I spent some time in Iraq visiting various of the cities the ancient cities that he talks about. And he just says, guys, I'm really sorry, but it turns out most human cities that they did, start some of them in this part of the world, in around the Tigris and the Euphrates, modern day Iraq, and around there. He says the cities were horribly, horribly unsuccessful places. People went to them. They basically had to stop farming in a much more productive way, and to do the farming that supported the city. That meant that a lot of people starved, that people were endemically malnourished for generations. Also, when people came to the cities, they got lots more diseases. So most cities failed, and cities were awful for people for centuries. And it's great for us that we now get to live in a humanity that went through those horrible centuries and built cities and had civilization. But please do not fool yourselves. This was not a wonderful project. This was not like a, returning to Eden type project. Cities were awful, and we have to understand that we are living on graveyards, of people. And it's just like, it's a good story because it says the other story was a false story. This is a true story, and we can honor the people who came before us better as a result of it.
Yeah, and you can easily even see it in the archaeological record because people lost like 5 inches of their size, and you can see that they were malnourished in their bones, and you can see there's much higher percentage of young kids dying or young people dying, and you can see all of that in the archaeological record, right? So if we shrink in size and our bones are malformed, and we start developing, by the way, all kinds of spinal conditions because we're trying to toil the land and stuff like that, and which is why, by the way, Yuval Noah Harari calls the agrarian revolution history's greatest fraud, because it's perceived to be this kind of revolution, which often has this positive connotation, but actually we had shorter lifespan, more kids died, we were more sickly, we had more chronic pain and more chronic disease and conditions, and we became entirely dependent on 3 or 4, maybe top 5 staple crops, and therefore a lot more liable to famines and problems. So failure that you're talking about became a lot more common. But that brings me to the topic of how AI, for example, is related to storytelling too, because the origin story of AI would be absolutely crucial for the future of humanity, right? Because you're just giving examples of how humans or a nation or a people's origin story has such a strong pull on them that basically can guide them or direct them for thousands of years. Well, isn't that same thing true about AI? And think of it, let's say, if the origin story and the context kind of greatly sets up the origin story. So in the Jewish case, it's the Egyptian sort of slavery context, which sets up the Exodus story, right? Well, in the AI story context, you can have, let's say, military context, and we can pretty much predict what kind of origin story that AI would have, and how it would treat people like enemies, and how it would see definitely as one of the most likely possibility that it's okay to kill people, right? You can have a commercial context where AI is given birth to, and that kind of commercial story would easily predict that people are clients or tools to be used or data points to be gathered, and therefore manipulated as clients or customers or markets or any of that stuff. And maybe that's probably an idealistic take of it, but let's say if you have an open source kind of a collaborative context where AI is given birth to, maybe you have a higher likelihood of the AI eventually perceiving humanity as partners to collaborate with, side by side, kind of, right? So that's kind of oversimplifying it in many ways, but those kinds of origin stories about the AI itself would have great impact not only on the AI, but our relationship with the AI and how things could pan out in the future.
Yeah, for sure the way we start thinking about something tends to structure the way that we go on with it. I was just rereading my copy of Walter Benjamin's Illuminations. It's my copy from when I was 20, and I found it again recently. And I was just reading his. I don't know if you ever came across his essay thesis on the philosophy of history. It changed my life. In fact, it started my life. It just starts off. So Benjamin was a German Marxian philosopher, writer, collector in the 1920s and 30s, and he's just been incredibly influential in a lot of people. So he's got a great thing about Marxist history, but the beginning of it is it's about AI, and this is written in about 1919, 1920. He says the story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it could play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback, who's an expert chess player, sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophical counterpart to this device, the puppet called historical materialism. It goes on into an analogy about historical materialism. But wow, I just thought, here we are, the automaton that is actually powered by human labor. And that just, it's another origin story of AI, which is so much of what is currently sold as AI is, of course, cheap human labor that is kind of, funneled in from less lower labor cost economies. And I think, so many of the ways we're thinking about AI is a sort of a magical machine-like thing that exists outside of us, when of course it is just merely a manifestation of who and what we are.
Precisely, yeah. My point about reflecting our own essence and not having one of its own. But that makes me think about something else. That Mechanical Turk story, just like the hunched human chess expert is powering the automaton, our story of the birth of the AI would power the AI in a way.
Yeah, it will. And for my money, I think a lot of the military applications and uses are, seem to be where a lot of the capital is currently concentrated, and where the institutional incentives are such that it's, we're going to see, we already are seeing, obviously, the use of AI for target acquisition, use of AI to power what we used to call fire and forget missiles, but in fact to be able to path and redirect as they go, like basically taking away of human agency and responsibility from the act of killing people.
I actually wrote my master's thesis on that topic. And that's how I got into the whole thing about the singularity and discovered Ray Kurzweil, because, I was writing sort of in the early 2000s, and then the popular idea in academia was, let's say the most popular idea, or one of the, I'd say the most popular idea at the time, was Samuel Huntington's idea, the clash of civilizations. And we had these kind of friction points between the East and the West. And, Afghanistan was one of those points, and blah, blah, blah. And then we can explain everything. And so I argued in my master's degree thesis, which was written on drone warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, that what we're witnessing there is not the clash of civilization, but the first time in the history of the world where increasingly automated machines are taking increasingly automated decisions as per whether a human being would live or die.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what was unique about those conflicts, not that whole clash of civilizations. Because that's when we had the first Predator drones, which originally just the CIA had a couple of them, modified Predator drones. They killed someone in Yemen, and then they started using them in Afghanistan and Iraq, and eventually people started deliberately producing them, and so on and so on. That was 20 years ago, and now we have tens of thousands of them. But Maria, I love talking to you. We are already way past our allotted time, but I want to keep you for another 20 minutes or so, if it's okay, because I really want to talk about first your Techbro articles, which is, I think, damn brilliant, as I said in the beginning, and I can't forgive myself if we don't go over it. And then sort of go back to the big picture for our final sort of takeaway message. But let's talk a little bit about Tristan Harris as an example, specific example of the Prodigal Techbro, what you call the Prodigal Techbro, but also as a prototype of that hero's journey, that type of a hero's journey. Because what happened was, I had Tristan on my podcast, and I really liked the guy, and I felt like I was a total asshole to him. We kind of had a big disagreement. In my opinion, he didn't know what technology means. He had no clue, certainly, about what ethics actually is, which I'm discovering more and more often that people who are in a very key tech positions with ethics something in their title, like design ethicist or something, they don't have basic clue about what actually ethics means or stands for or is. Um, but on the other hand, I really like him, so I tried to even delete many of the things from the interview. I edited. I even undercut my own opinion of him by putting his other work at the beginning of the article. I even called him my hero, which is not entirely honest. But I said that I'm more demanding and more expectant of my heroes, because if you're my hero, I expect you to know more, to be more, to do more. And I was disappointed in that sense in Tristan, that I discovered he doesn't really know more. He doesn't do more. And he's like really like not quite there yet. And so I really felt like an asshole towards a nice guy. And then, like, I don't know, almost a year later, I get to read your article. And my thing is like, damn it, she nailed it. How didn't I see it that clearly at the time, first? And second, I should have been harder on him. I should have been even harder on him. And, of course, one thing which often happens with people who come on my podcast is like they want to forget that they've ever been on my podcast. And that was a great example of that. Because as his PR person said, they want to spread the message. They want to spread the message. And my response to that was like, well, my concern is first you have to live the message before you're able to spread it, or before you're worthwhile spreading any message, you actually have to live it. And I'm not sure you guys are living it. Secondly, you have to focus on having a good message, a proper message. I'm not sure you got that part either. So if you just expect me to blindly spread your message, no. And that happened, with Bill Nye, the science guy. It happened with a bunch of other people on my show who come, do an interview, and then they want to forget that they've ever been to my podcast. Because maybe, that's my hypothesis, they perceive themselves that they don't look so good in that podcast or in that particular occasion. And also because they get challenged sometimes in a way that they're not used to be challenged. And maybe they don't see the reflection, or they don't enjoy the reflection that's coming back at them, and then they want to forget it, and they never share, never comment, never reply to my email afterwards, etc. So that's happened quite a few times. But so that was like a arrogant, selfish digression, I should probably say, about me and my work. Let's go to you and your work, which is the important stuff here, which is the Techbro article. Tell us, what's the gist of your argument and the core of the problem with Tristan Harris in particular, and the prototypical sort of, I've lost my way, I found my way again, now come see my TED Talk kind of tech guy?
Yeah. So I'm not so concerned with particular individuals so much as the broader phenomenon. And I think that's one example of it. But so I wrote this piece called The Prodigal Techbro, which was about, and I wrote it, it was published in on the Conversationalist in, I think, early this year, probably March, April, May, sometime around then. And then it kind of went somewhat viral again during the Social Dilemma film, that was documentary that was on Netflix a month or two ago. And so this story is about, it's asking why are not just the same kind of guys, but the same actual guys who helped build up the social media empire with all of its deleterious effects. Why are they at the center of the conversation about how to fix it? And it uses a really well-known story, at least in a Bible story, so for one tradition, about the prodigal son. And the prodigal son is a parable told by Jesus. And it's a story about religion and about forgiveness. And it's a lovely story. It's basically a landowner, has two sons. And the younger son comes to him one day and says, I want to cash in my inheritance, and I want to go away and live my life. And the father is a bit sad, but says, okay, fine. And basically sells a bunch of land or whatever he has to do, gives his son a load of money, and the son goes away, not to seek his fortune so much as to spend his fortune. And so this son goes to a neighboring country, spends all of his money on alcohol, on women. I'm always a little bit offended by how women are always treated as a commodity that you spend money on, and it's a bad thing. But anyway, we'll leave that for the time being. He spends all of his money and he runs out of money, and all of the friends who he had when he had loads of money to spend and disappear, and he's on his own, and he has to get a job. He can't get a job because he has no skills. And so he ends up begging and receiving a position as a swineherd, as somebody who looks after pigs. And the job is so lowly, it doesn't pay money, it doesn't even pay food. He literally is reduced to eating the food that the pigs eat, to eating their leftovers, to eating the leftovers of swine. And, for so many cultures, pigs are the lowest of the low, which is unfortunate because pigs are really, really intelligent creatures. We used to have a pet pig. Anyway, I'm not going to go there. So this is the prodigal son, and he kind of reaches his rock bottom in that moment when he is literally eating the pig's food, and he says to himself, I am so much worse off than one of my father's servants. I am going to renounce what I've done and return to my father's house and beg him to take me on as one of his servants so that I can earn an honest wage and eat again. And that's where I need to go. And so he returns to his father's house, and his father sees him coming, orders the fatted calf to be slaughtered, throws a big party. The prodigal son's older brother, his older brother, complains to the father and says, I've done the right thing all these years. I haven't been given so much as a goat to have with my friends. And now you're slaughtering the fatted calf for this guy who's gone off and spent his inheritance. And the father basically says, all the joy in heaven comes to somebody who's sort of repented and come back, and he's my son and I love him. And so that's a long retelling of that story, but it's a long retelling because the story of the prodigal son is so often kind of squeezed until the good and important bits are gone from it. And the really important bit that is gone from it so often, and is very much in the story of the prodigal Techbro, is guys who used to work for big tech companies doing pretty awful things, making a shit ton of money, have now somehow come to their senses and are now somewhat sorry about what they've done, but mostly need to be at the center of helping us figure out what we do now. And the important thing is about, that's not the story of the prodigal son. Like, the story of the prodigal son is somebody who made a terrible decision, who lost everything and realized that he had no further claim to status or money and had to beg to be given the lowliest position. And just because his father was a forgiving type of person, his father let him come back into the house. And although friends of mine have told me since that, in fact, his father, they believe, because of their reading of local law at the time, that he was actually not going to get the inheritance again. So there is that. But he got a big party. But the prodigal Techbro is about how we sort of moved up along the bench and made space for these guys to be at the very, very center of the conversation, when we've missed the important bit of the story. And the important bit of the story is when you repent. And I'm sorry, it's an old school concept, but it says something really important about the moment in the story where the prodigal son says, I fucked up so badly that nobody should ever listen to me again. And I'm just going to have to spend the rest of my life trying to be a lowly servant. And that's not what these guys are about, the Center for Humane Technology or whatever it's called. And, I've come across a couple of others of them in Cambridge and that. And
there's a whole industry of them.
There's a whole industry of this stuff. And at no point in their kind of narrative arc is there ever the moment of, so guys, I used to be the director of monetization at Facebook. All of those teenage girls who, were committing self-harm because of the way we drove the algorithms to make them feel like shit, I feel terrible about that. I am so fucking sorry. You shouldn't actually be listening to me, so I'm going to go away now. That's kind of that's what it would be if it was the prodigal son, but that's not what it is.
But as you know yourself, the irony and that's where your article comes to hit home so well is that, let's say me and you are applying to get a keynote speaking position to a conference, and this guy is, chances are the organizers and many other people would be like, oh yeah, he was like the head of monetization of Facebook. Let's get him. Who are these bozos? You know,
Yeah.
oh, they've been talking about what he wasn't supposed to do for the last decade or longer. It doesn't matter. He's the guy who was in charge of monetization, right?
Yeah. And like you say, it's the hero's journey. It appeals to us because we kind of think we sort of just foreshorten the whole, ugly, messy human bit where somebody goes, I fucked up. I'm really sorry. I'm going to try and do better. And just gone to, I was a really shiny tech executive, and now I'm a really shiny tech speaker, evangelist. I've got my own center. It's in, whatever it is. Sorry. And like, yeah, I don't want to be too much about one person because, and I'll tell you why. It's not just because I'm squeamish about kind of being unpleasantly criticizing one individual. But it's more because this is a structural problem. This is,
I agree with you completely. Yeah.
not a one-off. And so here's my theory about what is actually going on here. I think because also I did a speaking thing in Cambridge for lovely friends of mine, but also about one of these books by these guys.
I watched that video. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, so yeah, I was polite, I think.
Oh, you were good. You're very good. I'm a
Thank
lot
you.
less polite when I go to speak at those places, let me tell you.
I'm getting less polite, definitely. I'm getting less polite.
It's
It's
funny because I'm actually moving the other way. I think I'm getting to be more polite. I used to be a lot worse, and now you're going the other way. That's funny.
the other way around. Yeah. So what I think is happening is that there are lots of social affordances, let's call them that, for let's center the white guy in the discourse. Okay, we know that, so let's park that one. I think what's also going on here is what are the acceptable are what critiques of technology are acceptable to Silicon Valley and to executives in those companies and to funders of centers in Stanford and this place and that place. Like, what kinds of arguments are acceptable in that they're somewhat critical, but they don't really go to the center of the business model, right? And are there people who can make those arguments in ways where they're worried, like we're still their friends, they are worried that we will not take their calls. So who are the people who can make those arguments that are acceptable to us? So I think in a way this is just the public manifestation of Silicon Valley funding its weakest opponents. I think it's as simple as that.
That's brilliantly put. That's brilliantly put. And I would be amiss if I want to read the whole piece on the podcast just because it's so brilliant. But I want to read 2 or 3 excerpts just because it's so dead on, like, critical, and it's so well written. So you say, we all need second chances, even if we don't need those fresh starts ourselves. We want to live in a world where people have a reason to do better. But the Prodigal Techbro's redemption arc is so quick and smooth, it's barely a road bump. That's because we keep skipping the most important part of the Prodigal Son story, where he hits rock bottom. And you already were talking about that. Then you continue to say a little later, it's a great metaphor for how to run a religion, but a lousy way to run everything else. Prodigal Techbro stories skip straight from the past when they were part of something that, surprise, turned out to be bad, to the present, where they are now moral authority on how to do good, but without the transitional moments of revelation and remorse. And that's the part where I got so disappointed that he's even clueless about what ethics means or even what the origins of technology are. There I was lost, but now I'm found. Please come to my TED Talk. Accounts typically miss most of the actual journey, yet claim the moral authority of one who's been there but came back. It's a teleportation machine, but for ethics. This is just pure genius, I swear. The only thing that more fungible than cold, harsh cash is privilege. The Prodigal Techbro doesn't so much take an off-ramp from the relatively high status and well-paid job he left when the scales fell from his eyes, as zoom up on an on-ramp in a new sector that accepts the reputational currency he has accumulated. He's not joining the resistance. He's launching a new kind of startup using his industry contacts for seed funding in return for some reputation laundering. This is like brilliant stuff. uh, and you went towards the end to say the prodigal tech bro doesn't want structural change. He's reassurance, not revolution. He's invested in the status quo if we can only restore the founder's purity of intent. This is brilliant. I actually pushed on him on all those points. You know how Robert McKee was making exponential return on Facebook, and then maybe gave $1 million to Tristan to found the Center for Humane Society. So you're making $1 billion worth of damage on the one hand, and you're giving like a penance to clear up your conscience on the other end with $1 million. It's kind of like highly disproportionate, you know, exponential damage, linear kind of fixing of the things, if it's fixing anything at all.
Yeah, at least medieval indulgences, the donors were not allowed to say what it went to. They just had to give the bloody money and piss off. Well, you know, it's interesting because also, you know, not just centering the kinds of people and their career paths and why we want, like, you know, I think you have a lot of sort of emotions about like that interview, also because there is something in us that wants that guy to be the hero. We want the person who has been on that journey to be better, and we want him to have the answers and the solutions, you know, because it sort of means that nothing fundamental has to change if the same people who did this can fix this, right? You know, we've got a really profound need for that guy to be the protagonist, and it's just not that kind of story. You know, we're not going to get that kind of emotional payoff. um, the other thing is, I look at the issues that the sort of permissible issues of those sorts of people, you know, the permissible critiques tend to be about social media is bad because the algorithms and the way content is and engagement is pushed at us and cause us to spend more of our time than we would like to using these devices. And so they take our time away and they take our attention. And our attention is the most powerful and important, profound thing we have, where we decide to choose it. And I sort of think, you know, on one level, I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I use one of these things. You know, I wish I didn't have to, but there you go. But also, it's such a fucking privileged position to be in. Like, your problem with the thing that broke democracy and that is driving rape culture, your problem is that it makes it a bit hard for you to get through your to-do list. Like, seriously, that's the fucking structural problem that you see with this stuff. That is not a problem. Like, you know, and it's just, yeah, the attention stuff. And that's kind of permissible type of argument they're allowed to make, which is these things take away our attention. So we must kind of tweak them so that they, you know, they're not getting between us and sleep.
So tell us more about the way that they should be properly criticized.
So straight off, and I think, you know, there are some people who have managed the one step in Silicon Valley, one step out of it slightly better, somewhat better. Jaron Lanier is an interesting guy in that he's at least able to say, it's the fucking business model. Excuse my French. Sorry, it's getting late in the day. It's the business model, stupid. You know, the fact that we have decided that the only way to intranet in 2020 is by using advertising surveillance. Like, that is a historically contingent choice that is based on very, very narrow definitions of shareholder interest and, you know, executive privilege. This is not the only way to intranet in the world, but we are presented with it as this is the only way we can possibly imagine having the internet for everyone is to base it on ad tech. That's bullshit, you know? So straight away, you know, as soon as ad tech goes away, all the problems about attention and, you know, clicks and radicalization, all of that stuff goes away. There are then hard problems about how do we fund this stuff? How do we distribute it? How do we do the infrastructure? You know, basically, do we use taxation? Do we use revenue, you know, subscription models? Like, how do we, as a society, make sure that we have connectivity for everybody?
They would talk to you about incentives and incentivizing. How do you incentivize innovation if you don't have that, they would say.
Yeah, and I'd say, how do humans do things that are bigger than us? We use institutions to do them. And we develop all sorts of political structures around those institutions to make sure those institutions are responsive to us and serve our better interest collectively. It brings them out in hives because then you're talking about governments and states. But like, you know, how do we solve water? We don't get, the private sector does not solve water for us. How do
But
we
they would
solve?
say you're a communist because what you want to do right now is you want
Yeah.
to nationalize Facebook and Google and you want to turn them into an institution where they are corporations and their highest duty is to the shareholders.
Personally, I know I'm not a communist. I'm just a kind of very mild mannered European social democrat. I just sound like a fucking communist because these guys are so extreme. Um, we can do internet in so many different ways once we realize that it's public infrastructure. It's like electricity, it's like clean water, it's like the ability to walk down the street without being afraid of being raped. Like it's a collective public good that is absolutely necessary for humans to function happily and productively in society. And when we need to do big things, we come together and build big institutions and we build ways to hold them accountable. This is what humans do.
It's funny because I did a speech on new technocracy where I argued that the future is a public good and shouldn't be privatized.
Yeah.
It's not like a Disneyland, some private corporate retreat where or it shouldn't be at least, right? Because it should be a public good and it should be something that we all create for each other rather than a place that we go to visit. Because
Yeah.
right now the idea is come to visit Singularity University and you'll be visiting the future. That's kind of the narrative, right? And that's why Singularity University has been so popular, is because, oh, you want to see the future? Come visit us. Come visit Silicon Valley, NASA's Ames campus, Google, Facebook, and you'll see the future. Whereas my argument, and it took me a while, I have to say, to get to it, was like, that's not a future. That's just like your skewed, partial, self-serving story of the future in which you're on top and everyone else is just following your lead. And that may actually be the path to our destruction.
Massively. That's like, show me your brilliant healthcare system, and you're like, here's this wonderful, private room in a hospital with all of the incredible, technology and choices and fantastic best doctors in the world at your disposal. And I'm like, yeah, that's one part of your healthcare system. The other part of your healthcare system is Black women dying in childbirth and pregnancy and labor because you don't even have basic healthcare. Like, these are both parts of the system, but you're showing me the shiny bit. I don't believe it.
Yeah, the average Canadian lives about 3.5 years longer than the average American. And
You
we are
know,
very, 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 very similar. We have almost the same economy in so many ways. We're very close to each other in so many ways. Like if there's one country that's the closest to the US, that's Canada. And yet we live on average almost 4 years longer than the average American.
yeah. So,
Uh,
in a way, like what America is doing with these big tech companies is exporting a view of the world that basically says, we're going to do the internet the way Americans do healthcare, you know? And that is a terrible, terrible idea. And it's massively destructive. But coming back to the state thing and being a communist, because that's kind of the play that when you talk about public infrastructure and how we provide it collectively, the first place Silicon Valley type guys go is you're a communist, and then the second kind of concern troll place they go is, oh, I wish we could, but like it's the tragedy of the commons. There's nothing we can do about that. And so, there you are. And actually, the tragedy of the commons, is one of those false narratives, false origin myths about how we do stuff collectively. And Russell Hardin's piece was, what was it, like 16 pages long. It is tens of thousands of references to it. I mean, it's just one of the most viral things ever. And it has been shown repeatedly and comprehensively to be incorrect about how we manage commons themselves and common goods. And you look at the actual empirical lifetime of work that Lynn Ostrom has done or did. And she won a Nobel Prize for her work on how humans sustain and manage commons all around the world in all types of places. And
Take
like
British
that's
Columbia, for example. The natives, the natives lived there for thousands of years in harmony with nature. Europeans came in, and in 200 years, we fished out all the fish. The salmon was gone. We cut out all the trees and everything. Why? Because again, our origin stories are very different, right? And because part of our origin story is that idea of the, Hobbesian Leviathan, the merry state of nature of war against war, one against all and all against one, and also that kind of tragedy of the commons. But the natives who lived there for thousands of years never went out of equilibrium. They were in total equilibrium for thousands of years, right? So they managed the commons quite well.
Yeah, I'm getting involved with a foundation in Australia and hoping to do some work with them on Indigenous futurism, because in various Indigenous people around the world, you have whole literatures that are very, very different from our kind of Western canon of it's got to be novel sized and shaped, it's got to have a protagonist, it's got to have conflict, it's got to have closure. It ends when we do. I just am really kind of getting into talking to some people about different storytelling traditions, which I think are going to be key for us in the future. Because two things really: one, several of the Indigenous storytelling traditions I've come across so far have a lot of the kind of the collective work that those stories do is to think about, how do I be a good ancestor? As in, how do I be a person who does good for the people who will come after me? Like, I don't read that in most of our novels. I'm reading it like there's, Kim Stanley Robinson is a science fiction writer who's doing fantastic work on that. But like as in literature as the whole, there's not a huge amount of that. And then the other is, how do I be a good community member? There's a writer called Daniel Heath Justice, actually, who's in Ottawa, I think. And he writes a lot about, Indigenous literatures and how they try and sort of inculcate and interrogate those kinds of values and questions. And it's not to say that, there's this one perfect people who are untouched by Western civilization and they will save us. That's all levels and kinds of problematic. But there are different storytelling traditions that I think we're going to need to tap into and learn from, because also a lot of those Indigenous storytelling traditions are about and from people whose futures were ripped away from them. Like and they go on, and their stories kind of grow around that. They grow around the wound and they incorporate the wound, and they tell the story of it. It's like, how do you imagine a future when the future you thought you were going to have, has been taken away? And that's what we're going to need to be doing over the next century.
Funny you say that, because one of the conclusions I reached when I working on my own sort of rewriting the human story, how our story determines our future, was precisely that we need to go beyond humanism or transhumanism, that there's a danger of a single story and a benefit to many stories, and how the future cannot be told by one person, one nation, one ethnicity, one religion, maybe not even one species, but it has to be kind of a mosaic, and has to be able to have space to maybe even incorporate, even leave space or clearing for the stories of other species or intelligent or sentient beings. But speaking of Kim Stanley Robinson, you reminded me, I'm going to be interviewing him at the end of the month, and I know you've mentioned him so many times in your articles, so I give you this unique opportunity. If you have one question to ask him, what would that be?
What would I ask Kim Stanley Robinson? Funnily enough, we're doing a seminar with him on Crooked Timber about his new book, The Ministry for the Future. So
we're doing an interview in that book too. Yeah.
Oh my God. I don't know what I would ask him. I think probably mostly I would just want to thank him. Thank him for New York 2140, which is the most joyous, liberatory book about the near future, and how we don't get saved by a couple of plucky protagonists, about how it's collective action and how he manages to make something novel sized and shaped out of collective action. It's just joyous and riotous.
Now you're gonna have to make me read another book before I interview. So it's like I have to do even more work now. Damn it.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. But here's the thing. Can I just say that, like, I know we're going over time, but there's a whole, I think that, like, novel shaped stories, and I think, and I hope we're going to be able to expand them into more immersive media over the next decades. I don't necessarily see the book as being, I would love for us to make stories that we can almost literally live inside, because I think novel stories that have kind of enough thickness and depth and uncertainty without resolution are thinking and feeling spaces where we individually and collectively do the work that we have to do in order to imagine different futures. And part of the collective work we have to do is stuff we really shy away from, especially in Western culture, but that is mourning. We have to mourn the future that we thought we were going to have, a future ever brighter and better and progressive and more techy and shiny and all of those things. Like, we're not going to have that future. And for us to be able to do the work of building good futures, plural, that we can have, I think we first have to do the work of coming to terms with the fact that we fucked this up. Like, as
The
a
future
generation,
is dead. Long live the future.
the future is dead, long live the future. But also, I'm 48. My generation, and I think probably my parents' generation, history is not going to be kind to us, nor should it be. And we have to, and for us to sort of be able to collectively set up a situation where other people can do good work, I think part of it is getting past that Trumpian, I'm angry about the future because I hate it, so I'm going to try and elect a government that only punishes other people. I think novel-sized, novel-shaped things help us to think through and process and do the work of mourning, which is, solastalgia, about mourning the damage we have done to the climate, mourning the world we have killed, so that another world can be reborn. I think there's a huge amount that we need. And we also need novels and novel-shaped things, perhaps immersive media, that allow us to decenter ourselves and not, constantly expect a protagonist, a Tristan Harris, to come and save us. Like, he is just one guy. I personally would not want to be hard on him at all, because he is carrying the weight of expectations of people who want a hero to save us, and that's not going to happen. And we need to live inside novel-shaped things that help us come to terms with that.
It's funny you say that, because that was I wrote that piece to go along with the interview, and I said, Tristan was my hero, but I'm tougher on my heroes because I expect them to be more, do more, know more, and all that. And maybe that's part of the issue. And you're nailing it so well, because I discovered he's not the hero I'm hoping for that's going to pull us out. So in part of my disappointment with that interview was precisely this. And becoming aware that there's no hero coming to save us, whether you call it a human being, or whether you call it a divine intervention, or whether you're calling it technological scientific breakthrough, none of those on its own is going to be sufficient or enough to get us through this century, perhaps.
Yeah. And also, like, I haven't really developed my thinking on this enough yet, but I think I really intuitively sense that our desire for stories to have endings and for us to see the ending, like, that's, you look at the Greenlander saga, or the Eric the Red saga, or lots of different forms of storytelling. Even the Old Testament or the Bible, with all its problematic twists and turns, like, they're not about there being an ending, and I think we've kind of got a sort of a cultural set of desires and structure of feelings that requires resolution, and requires us to witness the resolution, and not merely witness it, but to bring it about. And I think if we're going to be able to pass enough on to the people who come after us, we have to get over this idea that we're going to be there for the saving the world bit. Because one, that's not us, unfortunately. We did not save the world. But two, the desire, to either save it or fuck it. Like, those neither of those things are options that are available to us. We have to decenter ourselves and realize that our job is just to leave enough choices, be they in terms of the topography of the internet and it not foreclosing every option for innovation and programming, or climate change or democracy. Like, our job is just to, like, hand over enough tattered shreds that the people who come after us can weave it into something new and functional again. That's all if we do that, we will be doing so well.
Wow. Maria, where can people go and find more about Maria Farrell and kind of learn about you and follow your work?
So I'm on Twitter, but I realize that's pathological, and I really shouldn't be. Um, so a place to go to find some of my work is a website that will be launching very shortly, which is mariafarrell.com, mariafarrell. And also, but for many years, I've been blogging on the group blog crookedtimber.org, and that's a great place to go. And then the two other places are Medium, where I've done a bunch of commissioned work, and also The Conversationalist, which is a fantastic journalistic enterprise, and I encourage you to look it up.
I actually plan to link to many of your articles that I enjoyed tremendously and that we mentioned during our conversation today. So we touched on so many things today. We spent enormous amount on the importance of story, which was kind of a pleasant surprise to me also. What's the one thing that you want to send us away with?
The one thing I'd love to send people away with is something I've noticed recently, and I knew you wouldn't do this because you're better than this, Nicola, is people often conclude interviews with, so do you feel optimistic or pessimistic? And I think that's just such a BS question, because this isn't about our feelings. What I would like to send people away with, and what I think is a much better question, is you see the problems we have in the world. What are you doing about them? I know what I'm doing. I'm trying to come up with better metaphors, better stories, get them out into the world. I'm trying to be a better, participant in political organizing and collective work. And I'm trying to be a better friend and neighbor. That's what I'm doing. And I think the one thing I kind of would like to send people away with is we face vast, centuries-wide, structural, existential problems as a species, and yet we're each only one person. And as Ada Palmer said on a previous podcast of yours, which I've listened to obsessively, small victories and partial victories are victories. So which victories are you working towards, and how are you going to get there?
Wow, that's very beautifully said. Maria Farrell, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, cheers. Thank you, Nicola, for having me.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.